and welcome to Keep the Bastards Honest, the podcast of the Australian Democrats. I'm your host, Elana Mitchell, and on this episode, we're looking at the Job Summit, tax cuts, and other matters of interest. Firstly, my apologies for the erratic release schedule that our regular listeners are being subjected to at the moment. If you're a new listener, welcome. Wonderful to have you on board. One of the pitfalls of producing a podcast in my spare time as a volunteer is that sometimes events, dear boy, events get in the way and I end up with no spare time. I'm hoping that the schedule settles down over the next few weeks as there's a lot going on that we want to have a chat to you about, so stay tuned. Speaking of events, at the beginning of September, my co-host Steve Baty and I got together to discuss the Job Summit, how the Albanese Government was tracking after its first few months in office, the Stage 3 tax cuts, and the odd coincidence that the Governor-General got his charity funded around the same time that Scott Morrison was signed into his secret ministries. And all of this is, in some ways, even more relevant today than it was back when we recorded it, although the Governor-General's charity has rightly had its funding terminated since recording. Steve and I pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the lands upon which we recorded this episode and their elders past and present. Sovereignty never ceded. Right, so goodness, I hope everyone's had a toilet break and a cup of tea and they've settled in for the long haul because this is going to be epic. So very quickly, I don't want to give Scott Morrison any more airtime than he absolutely has to have, but the secret ministries thing is continuing to unfold, as you would have said, and Karen Middleton is on fire on this subject in the Saturday paper, as we predicted. And then the Governor-General is getting increasing scrutiny on his charity that he, again, I'm not suggesting for a second that the Governor-General has done anything hinting of corruption, but it just seems really, really convenient that at the same time that he's swearing Scott Morrison into secret ministries, Morrison is arranging to give him seed funding for this charity, so that $18 million up front. And then we found out during the week that it then gets $4 million a year funding in perpetuity, which is a bit mind-boggling.
It's a little unusual. Let's put it that way. It's a little unusual that anybody gets signed up to government funding forever. The ABC doesn't get funding forever. The CSIRO doesn't get funding forever. They both have to come back and put their hand out. But the Governor-General's elite leadership program for what appears to be a finishing school for private schoolboys gets funding for forever. Like it just doesn't make sense. And when you put those two things together, even if they're not connected, when two things occur close together, one has to ask some questions. The way in which Morrison was appointed to administer those ministries was highly irregular. The way in which this funding instrument has been drafted is highly irregular. I don't know what else to say about it. It stinks. If we had a federal ICAC, I'd refer it. I'd want someone to look at it. I want some questions asked, because it just doesn't feel kosher at all.
No. And Ronnie Salt, who's citizen journalist par excellence on Twitter, has been stressing, I think for some days now, that there is an enormous difference between the office of the Governor-General and David Hurley the man. And everyone from Prime Minister Albanese down seems to be getting those two things mixed up, because there does seem to be this reluctance on the part of the government to look sideways at the Governor-General over this.
And yet it feels like somebody should be.
Yeah. So I sorted out, I'm not sure if you saw it, but on Twitter today, I saw Monique Ryan, Dr. Monique Ryan had moved a disallowance
MP for Kooyong.
Yes.
Yes.
One of our beautiful community-backed independents has moved a disallowance motion in the House of Reps to prevent this funding from going ahead, because Ronnie Salt was saying there's something like, and I can't remember at what time she was saying this, but she said that there's basically only 6 days left before this will just go ahead and be funded. And so Parliament has to do something about it basically this week, beginning the 5th of September, on whether or not they're going to allow it to go ahead or whether they're going to nip it in the bud. And I believe Tammy Tyrrell from the Jammy sorry, Jackie Lambie Network has also moved a similar motion in the Senate. And I'm not sure. I think you were saying that Andrew Wilkie is backing Dr. Ryan's motion.
Correct. Yes.
Not sure who's backing Tammy Tyrrell's. It might even be Jackie Lambie, or it might be David Pocock. That could be a walk of shame. But yeah, it's really, really interesting that the crossbench are all over this and basically not having it. So,
Yeah.
democracy seems to be working to an extent.
To an extent,
Yeah.
which is nice. It makes for a nice change. A breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
Good. Hopefully they go through. It would be good to see that funding stop. It's probably not the most egregious misuse of public funds that we saw over the last 9 years, but it's certainly not a good one.
It's not great. And particularly at a time when everyone's carrying on about how we can't afford a lot of stuff because apparently the budget and sure, people can go, well, $18 million and then $4 million annually in perpetuity. It's not that not that much money, but ask anybody on JobSeeker how much that $4 million a year would do for all the people on JobSeeker, and I think they would have very different thoughts on it. So it's all proportionate. It's all, if we can't afford to raise JobSeeker to a livable level and lift people out of poverty, then the Governor-General can do without his finishing school for privileged white boys.
I think so. And there are a lot of groups out there who struggle to get funding, that they can rely upon for more than 12 months at a time, who are trying desperately to help a lot of people who really need it, all of those sorts of things. And yet here we are throwing money at a group of people who don't really need extra funding in questionable circumstances.
Yeah, considering the number of NGOs, I can think of all of the domestic violence shelters that have had their funding not just cut, but in some cases terminated over the last decade. There's any number of charities and, as you said, groups that could desperately do with that funding. Hell, even like going back to sports frauds, even all those small community groups and clubs that got cheated out of funding for their facilities.
Yep.
That's money that could be directed to them.
Yeah, indeed. And as you say, at a time when we're having an argument over what we can afford and the tough decisions that we have to make in order to undertake some budget repair, and having inherited $1 trillion of Liberal Party debt, I think that's trademark Jim Chalmers, but having inherited this sort of government debt, Labor is very, very keen to point out that some tough decisions have to be made, and we'll come to that in just a moment. I know it just seems an odd one, and it just seems I'm really glad that someone has put forward a motion to put a stop to it. I really am.
Yes. And and it was something that I just remembered because it's Monday as we record this, and already it has been a week. There will be an investigation. I think it's a judicial inquiry into Morrison and his many ministries, which I think is an excellent move. Even though, actually, look, I'm going to have another kick at the media because it's the gift that keeps on giving.
Mm-hmm.
This narrative that emerged in the media over the last couple of weeks of, we're all bored with this now. Can we just move on from Scott Morrison and his ministries? And he didn't use the powers. Surely it's okay. And I have really enjoyed seasoned press gallery journalists like Paul Bongiorno, seasoned political operators like John Hewson, pushing back on it and going, no, this is incredibly serious and incredibly dangerous to our democracy, and we need to do something about these loopholes that enabled him to do this, and this isn't going away. And Albanese is not fixated on Morrison by, launching an inquiry into what the fuck he was up to.
It's a serious issue, and let's not forget that the argument that, well, I only used it that one time, which in Morrison's view proves that it wasn't really such a big deal. The one time he used it was to misuse those powers. The only time that he used it was essentially to get around a decision that he didn't like the legally appointed Minister of the Crown taking. The fact that he didn't do it any other time probably just suggests that he liked those decisions or was able to bully his way into getting what he wanted rather than having to play his trump card. Like the one time he did it was to abuse it. It wasn't to use it like in emergency funding for the pandemic because Simon Birmingham or Matthias Cormann or Greg Hunt were unavailable due to some catastrophic event. It was because Keith Pitt wasn't doing what he was told. Far out. Like that's not the argument that you think it is. Sorry, Scott.
Yes. That's a really good point. And the Solicitor General made it really, really clear that the use or not use of those powers was ultimately irrelevant. It was the grasping of those powers that was the problem, not whether or not he used them.
And then keeping them in secret. That it undermines one of the core principles of our democracy, that we actually know who's making the decisions and that we be able to hold them to account. And if we don't know who's making the decisions, it's a little difficult holding somebody to account. So, yeah, kind of legal within the broad constitutional clause that Section 64 of the Constitution, sure, you skated within it and trampled over a whole bunch of long-held conventions about how our democracy is meant to work in the process.
Yeah, and I think it might have been John Hewson or Paul Bondreno. I can't remember. This will teach me not to do my research before we record. But one of them pointed out that Stephen Donoghue, who is the Solicitor General, is sort of like the blackest of black letter lawyers. Like this guy literally does constitutional law in his day job.
Yeah.
And so for him to come back and say, no, this undermined representative democracy, and he said it several times in his findings, they're like, no, that is literally like DEFCON 4 levels of this, we have a problem. Coming from Stephen O'Donoghue, that is not it's not something to be skated over lightly. He was literally raising a very loud alarm over, this assault on democracy that occurred. And major media outlets, and look, the Murdoch papers aside, we know that they're going to do that, but even morning news and morning sort of like breakfast TV, we're just running with this narrative of, there's nothing to see here. Isn't this all just very, very boring? I despair about our media representation sometimes. I really do.
I find it funny, not funny, funny, that we had inquiry after inquiry into the Pink Bat scheme and what an awful tragedy that was, and misuse of government whatevers for a long period of time. Similarly, we dragged Julia Gillard's union past through the press and through Parliament, trying to get to the end, get to the bottom of her union involvement. No real surprise. It's like right there on a CV. But anyway, and yet this, which is quite an egregious breach of our Westminster conventions that underpin Australian democracy, it's like, wow, what are you beating up on the guy for? It's been 2 days already. Aren't we ready to move on? It's like, no, not really, because there are still some pretty fundamental questions that remain unanswered. Like they are. So let's get answers to them. And backed up by our Solicitor General, who really was quite clear on the fact that this is just not okay. And there are some gaps that we need to plug in the way our democracy operates.
Yeah. So stay tuned. Because I like I said in our last podcast, I feel like even though it's quietened down, it's been overshadowed by other events that have been taking place, which we will get to. I do feel like there's a sting in the tail on this one. This is going to come back to haunt. I think not just Morrison, but also Dutton.
There is no way that we're at the end of this particular scenario. This one's going to keep coming back. I can't believe for a moment that was the first time that he did it. I can't believe that it was only those 5. I reckon there are others, and I can't believe that people who've said, "Oh, I'm shocked. I tell you that gambling is going on in this establishment," don't know full well that it was happening. Like there's a lot more to come on this one, and even though what we've already seen is pretty bad, I can't for the life of me believe that that's the end of it. And if it was the end of it, if I was the Liberal Party, I'd be saying, go for your life, have an inquiry. waste your time, because there really is nothing to see here, and everyone will see that you're just trying to play this for all it's worth when there's really nothing more there.
Yeah.
But knock yourself out. Waste taxpayer money, waste media attention. Go for it. There's really nothing here. So what do we care? And it's Morrison, who, like, none of us are really going to support or protect anyway. So we don't care. Instead, there's been this vociferous support and this, really, really vigorous argument that we should all move on and not look any further, which makes me think, what the hell are you still hiding? What are you hiding? Show me what's in your hands. Yeah. Show me what's in your hands.
Because on the New Politics podcast on Saturday, the boys are making I can't remember if it was Eddie or Dave, but one of them was saying how nervous and sort of anxious Dutton is looking, and speculated that Dutton's, Dutton might be staring down the barrel to the end of his own career because of this Scott Morrison stuff.
Does Dutton, though, ever not look a little shifty?
Yeah, at the risk of playing the man, not the ball, I've seen photos of him when he was much, much younger and still in the Queensland Police Force and stuff. And even then, in uniform, he looked shifty. So he clearly, that's just clearly his vibe, which is unfortunate for him.
In fairness, he's not the first, maybe not the last. Apparently, he in those photos he was a thug and a union member. So I'd expect him to look a little shifty in those photos.
Oh, indeed. Yes, the irony of Dutton jumping up and down on the sidelines about the Jobs and Skills Summit being like a union summit and a talk fest of the union thugs. And then we discovered that he was a strong supporter of the police union and had joined them from the moment he joined the police force.
Of course you do.
Yeah.
You know why? Because they protect you.
Protect you when you do something dodgy.
They're a good thing. Unions are a good thing. Unions are a good thing. Yes, unions are a good thing. Anyway, yes.
So yes, enough of all of that. Let's finish kicking the media and then the Liberal Party, because look, I'll admit that doesn't get old. So I think we've finally reached. I think not so much that the honeymoon is over for the Albanese government, because News Poll this week has indicated that it very much is not over, because the Liberals' two-party preferred vote has dropped to the lower, to 31%, which is the lowest it's ever been. I think they have hit this low in the past, but it's sort of like joint lowest. And
wait until next week.
Yeah, that's right. And obviously, Albanese's preferred prime minister is just killing it at the moment. I think he's on 60%, and Peter Dutton is Mr. 17%. But I feel like for us as a minor party whose raison d'etre is accountability and transparency and integrity, I think the honeymoon for us has actually ended.
There's been a few things. There's been a few things. It's been 100 days, and 100 days is apparently plenty of time to do a whole bunch of stuff. And it's what has been done in some parts and what hasn't been done in other parts that has kind of been disappointing, I think.
Yes, yeah. And look, this is not to diminish any of the genuine achievements that they've managed in their first 100 days. I mean, they've managed more in 100 days than I think the coalition managed in the entire decade that they were in power. So there's a lot to be said for that. Yeah. But there are thingies and emerging that have me going, oh, really?
Really?
Come on.
Yes. So what are those things?
Well, number one for me at the moment is the thing that is really pissing me off at the moment is the stage 3 tax cuts. And the way that it's not just the fact that they are continuing to dig down and defend leaving them legislated. It's the ever-shifting stories we're getting about why they can't repeal those tax cuts.
I was just going to say, and let's be really, really clear, dear listener, they can repeal them.
Yes. So line number one is that they can't do anything about it. This is a decision of a former government, and it's done. And it's like, well, yeah, it was a decision of a former government, which you opposed at the time, until, as Catherine Murphy has immortalised, you bitched and folded, and you waved those tax cuts through. And in their defence, they waved them through in order to allow the stage 1 and stage 2 tax cuts that would benefit low and middle income earners. But in order to get those benefits, they had to wave the stage 3 ones through. And now that they're in power and now that they have the power to repeal those tax cuts, apparently can't be done. And look, I like Jim Chalmers. I think he's proving to be a good pair of hands on the treasury on the checkbook of Treasury.
Sure. Yeah.
But this sort of insinuation in one of his discussions with somebody was that, well, we tried to oppose them a few years ago and we had to pass them through because otherwise we would have been crucified. It's like, no, dude, you do not get to pass the blame onto the electorate.
The law books are full of the decisions made by previous governments. You change them every day.
Yeah.
You repeal bits, you amend bits, you add completely new bits. It's your whole business. It's the entire reason you get out of bed in the morning. It's not to sit there and go, but that went through from an old government, so we just can't touch it.
No.
It's literally your job to go and touch those things. Go touch them.
Yeah, and the other thing that, and I've been doing a slow burn on this all week, as you can probably tell. The next phase was, they're just sitting back and they're waiting until enough public outcry has emerged.
The four-dimensional chess argument. Yeah, keep going. Keep going.
So the whole idea that they're waiting for sufficient public outrage to emerge over this to give them cover to then repeal it, because it's like, oh no, we're going to break this election promise because the public wants us to. It's all good. And it's like, well, number one, you shouldn't have made that fucking promise in the first place.
Good point.
Right? And I get why, I get, they made it during the election campaign. They were asked specifically about it. And the media has a lot to be responsible for in this endless game of ruling shit in and taking stuff off the table and ruling stuff out.
Yeah.
The media does not serve us well when they look to box in our leaders in order to then set up a gotcha moment trap further down the track.
Yeah.
Because the fact that those tax cuts should never have been legislated in the first place is probably a topic for another podcast. But the fact that the world is really, really different now from 2019 when those tax cuts were legislated.
Yeah.
I mean, they were legislated at a time when we never imagined we'd be in the middle of a pandemic. We never imagined that Russia would invade Ukraine and we'd have global inflation out of control or anything like that. The world has changed markedly, and those not fit for purpose tax cuts at the time that they were legislated are really not fit for purpose now. And there is no way that any government, whether it be Labor or Liberal or Democrats or the Greens or the Independents, if they ever managed to form government, because we'd have to change our constitution to do that, there is no government of any stripe can justify keeping those tax cuts.
You know what else has changed since 2019? The government. We've got a whole new government. That's what elections are for. We've got a whole new government.
Who knew?
We can change stuff. Things can be changed. Things can be changed, including a tax cut that was baked in years ago. It really doesn't make sense. And what's odd is that in the meantime, so whilst defending those tax cuts, and I think over the legislative period, it's a 10-year time frame, they're worth $243 billion. At the same time that we're saying we can't touch those, they've got to go through, we're also sitting there going, nothing else can be afforded.
Yeah.
We can't afford anything else. Sorry.
Yeah.
Just absolutely nothing. Everything else can't afford. This can't touch. Sorry, hands are tied.
Sorry, guys. Sorry. And that's the thing that's absolutely having me see red. And a number of political cartoonists that I follow on Twitter, also like John Kudelka has been on fire about this. And Fiona Katsoukas, she did one she did one cartoon on the tax cuts, and then the next day was sort of pitching for ideas idea suggestions on Twitter, and then just went, no, actually, I'm still too pissed off about the tax cuts, so I did the tax cuts again.
I'm going to do it again. Yeah.
And good on you, Fiona.
Why not? If it's still stuck in your teeth, then keep going at it. It is an odd thing for a Labor government to so stridently defend tax cuts that will, I think about 2/3 of the money will go to income earners above $200,000 a year or above $180,000 a year. Of that, 2/3 goes to men. The tax cuts don't kick in till $45,000 a year, which is where the changes start to come in. But for the next 3 tax brackets, it's about $29-30 billion worth of tax cut goes to the next 3 each.
Mm-hmm.
And then $120 billion goes to that last upper income bracket. But
bloody hell.
In every one of those tax brackets, we happen to have picked the part of the population at which men start to outnumber women, and it continues all the way through. And by the time you're in that top tax bracket, it really is 2/3 male. It's a big difference. So whilst we can do that, can't do any of this other stuff. It just doesn't add up.
No, we can't raise like job seeker or the single parenting payment, which overwhelmingly affects women because we're too busy giving $243 billion in tax cuts to men.
So here's the absurdity on like another one of these absurdities, but like some of the real sort of disappointment that I'm feeling with the Labor government. Jim Chalmers was quoted in the Australian Financial Review on Thursday last week saying that it just wasn't feasible to bring forward the childcare initiative. It's going to kick in July. On July 1, people are advocating that it be brought forward and, kick in on January 1. New year, new start of the school year, let's get this happening. And Jim Chalmers is there going, look, sorry, really just can't afford it, despite the massive economic multiplier that we know will come from doing it. It's an investment. It's going to pay off. Yeah. It's going to pay off in spades. It's going to pay off in multiples that you describe as massive gains. And yet, you won't do it, won't, because this is absolutely a choice. We could absolutely do it. Won't do that. Must do this other thing instead.
Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute.
Hi, Richard.
Has pointed out a number of times.
If you're listening.
If you're listening, yes. Richard has pointed out a number of times over the last few years that for every $1 you invest in childcare and childcare services, you get $2 back. So it's not even a case of bringing all that forward and making that investment. Literally will pay for itself twice over. But no, we can't afford it, Steve. Some sensible people have tried to put a little bit of lipstick on this particular pig by going, well, if you bring it forward to January 1, where are you going to find the workers to do the childcaring? To do the early childhood education, which is what this actually is. This is not babysitting. This is the start of children's education.
Yeah.
And that is a valid point.
Fair enough.
My response to that is, do you know how you solve that, kids? You fucking pay them properly. Because there are thousands upon thousands of former childcare workers who are highly educated, who are required to be highly educated in order to provide early childhood education to people, who have left the sector in droves because of the shit conditions and the shit wages. They literally get more money working at Bunnings or operating the drive-through at McDonald's than they do looking after the next generation of taxpayers. It's solvable. You double their, you pay them properly.
Yes.
And give them an incentive to return to the sector, you'll be able to staff it
pretty quickly.
Sorry, yes.
And this is where groups like Parenthood and Thrive Before 5 or Thrive by 5 are really pushing, is to get the sector back up and running in a way that, I don't know, I'm a little cynical, and I feel like the privatisation of childcare, through the early part of the 2000s, may have something to do with this, but let's save that conversation for another time. But there's the workers are there, pay them. That means that kids are being looked after, that frees up parents to be productive. And as we say, it's a 2-for-1 return. That's fantastic. That should be a no-brainer. Let's just go and do it. Instead, we can't afford it.
Yeah, allegedly. But we can afford to give tax cuts to high income earning men. So that's never not going to piss me off. Yeah.
Someone has to
And
look out for us.
I mean, Scott Morrison epitomised the type of members of the Liberal Party who, if they could get away with it, would literally hunt poor people for sport. I've said this in the past. He made childcare free. Granted, it was for a short period, and granted, it was the first thing he cut off when we got vaccines and it looked as though we're going to start emerging from the pandemic.
But for a few
But
glorious months.
Yeah, for a few glorious months, we had universal free childcare in this country, and the country did not collapse. Our economy didn't collapse,
Went
and
pretty
we
well,
had a
actually.
tiny glimpse of the brilliant future we could have had, like the brilliant kind of services we could deliver to people in this country.
Speaking of a brief glimpse of what this country could be like, during that same period, we raised the job seeker rate up to the poverty line. Brief period there during the pandemic, the job seeker rate, the unemployment benefit, was increased, I think, to about $90 a day, somewhere in that kind of range. But it was brought up to a level that was essentially the poverty line. The stories that came through during that period of people who survived on job seeker were around no longer having to choose between food, medicine, and their rent, but actually being able to feed their kids every day, buy medicines that they all needed for their chronic illnesses, and to not be worried about rent. Like, those are pretty standard things and pretty fundamental things that we should just be able to do in a country like Australia. But for a little bit of time, we did it. And then we dropped it again and plunged all those people back into poverty. Something else we could do with $243 billion instead, and I don't want to make light of the fact that living in poverty is awful. Living in poverty is awful. It's not good on any level whatsoever. We're going to talk about the Job Summit shortly, but living in poverty really is an unpleasant existence. People don't do it by choice, and the idea that we are willingly consigning hundreds of thousands of Australians to live in poverty is awful. It's just awful.
And that's the thing, like, it's not their choice, but it is the government's choice to consign them to poverty. And indirectly, it is the choice of the electorate, because we continue to allow governments to do this to people.
Yeah. And look, and again, just sort of something else that galls me, and I know, like, this gets up your nose as well, Elana, that today the Labor government was talking up the fact that there was the largest indexation increase in the various welfare benefits or welfare payments in the history, or in 30 years, or whatever the time period happened to be. But they were crowing about it. Look at our largesse.
Yeah, look how kind we are to all these poor people. Look how kind
we are. Look at what we're doing. And the fact of the matter is, it was just following CPI. In real terms, it represented an increase of exactly $0 by definition. And it happened whether they did anything about it or not. Like, it's literally in the legislation that it happens twice a year.
Yeah, it's literally automated. Like, this would have happened under any government. If Scott Morrison had been returned in May, this would have happened under his watch. He had no choice in the matter.
Someone
completely
from the
outside
Labor
of his
Party
control.
stood out there today and said, "Yeah, but we didn't stop it."
Oh my God! What?
Okay, we didn't stop it. Was the argument?
Sorry,
we didn't stop it.
Do they want to be congratulated for that?
Apparently, yeah, they do actually want to pat on the back. The increase, by the way, in case you're wondering, whether or not our job seeker recipients are about to run out and buy Cuban cigars, was $1.84. That was the increase. It was $1.84. Just peanuts. Peanuts. It's not. Yeah.
It's what's really disturbing me and has been very disappointing to me with sort of this ending of my honeymoon with the Albanese government, and which is not to say that I'm not happy that they're in government. I mean, they are definitely much better than the government they replaced, but that's not a high bar to clear, and they seem very, very determined to just scrape over the top of that bar and not soar the way a lot of us would have liked them to. what's really shitting me to tears is the way they trot out talking points that's like would not be remiss coming out of the mouths of Morrison or Frydenberg or
They're
Angus
exactly the
Taylor.
same in a lot of
Mm,
cases. Yeah, they're
yeah,
exactly the same.
like the whole. Well, we didn't stop this automated increase. Literally, like that is literally a Liberal talking point because, again, coming
The
back to the
kind of
hunting
thing that
poor
I would
people as
expect from
sport
Angus
thing.
Taylor. Yeah.
Yeah. You're literally supposed to be the Labor Party, the party of workers, the party of the vulnerable. You're supposed to be the left of politics, the progressive side of politics that actually gives a shit about people. And you're coming out with that shit.
It's not
Oh,
great.
no.
And look, we also saw last week the opening up or the granting of petroleum exploration licenses to 47,000 square kilometres of Australian coastline to explore for new oil and gas. It's like, and again, the talking points there were essentially exactly the same thing that we heard from Angus Taylor and from Keith Pitt and from Scott Morrison and Matt Canavan. So much was the decision in line with the former government that Matt Canavan came out in praise of it.
Oh, dear God.
Madeline King got kudos from Matt Canavan, and you've got to question your decision making when that's who it appeals to.
Yeah. And also their arguments that this is somehow going to help power prices,
It's
like
nonsense.
domestic power prices
It's just
right
complete
now.
nonsense. It's just
Total
complete
nonsense.
nonsense. It is complete nonsense. We could talk for hours about the degree to which that is nonsense, but trust me on this one, it's complete nonsense, listeners. There is absolutely no way that petroleum exploration that begins next year is going to have any impact on what's happening with gas prices. Because what's happening with gas prices is just straight up profiteering because they can, because that's the way the market was set up in Australia. It's not because we lack gas supplies in Australia. We've got heaps of it. Most of it gets sent overseas at vast profits that we see nothing of. More of it in a few years' time isn't going to change that. It's just not.
No. So I follow Rachel Withers on Twitter, who's
As should you all.
Yes, indeed. I was going to say, like, if you're not following Rachel, if you're on Twitter, you're not following Rachel, you need to start following her because she writes wasn't the brief, it was called The Briefing, it's now The Politics, which is the monthly's daily column summarising what's happened in today's politics, oddly enough. And what I have found immensely entertaining and gratifying over the last couple of weeks is watching Rachel tweeting about whatever shitfuckery is going on in politics today and getting seriously pissed off about stuff and then reading her column in which she writes about it far more eloquently and beautifully than I ever could and absolutely nails whatever the issue of the day is. So
I get the feeling that Rachel sits there from about 2 p.m. onwards, maybe, and for the next couple of hours, just tweets out this stream of like, this is the shit that's bothering me, and then sends a link of her Twitter feed to her editor and says, just
tidy that up.
Tidy this up.
Chuck a few hyperlinks into to cite my sources.
Please, I'm off to record the podcast. Goodbye.
That's right. In a nutshell, so yes. So much as I have kicked the media so far in this pod, there are some shining examples of how journalism should be happening in this country, and we need more of it. So shout out to Rachel on that one.
Yes.
So stage 3 tax cuts and this is what and Rachel has actually presciently pointed this out several times now, that this whole question of the stage 3 tax cuts, how that $243 billion could be redirected elsewhere in the economy and to what benefit is going to haunt this government until they either give in and repeal those tax cuts or those tax cuts go into effect. And the longer this government carries on about all the shit they can't afford to do, they're going to get asked about.
I think she's spot on.
Yeah, she is. And it's, as you said before, it's a really strange hill for a party of the worker to choose to die on.
Yeah.
Is tax cuts for rich bastards.
Yep. And I am not willing to trust yet And there are any number of people who would suggest to me that I just need to be patient and trust. And, like Laura Tingle is one of the people who think that this is just a waiting game until the Labor Party gets enough cover from public outcry that they can go, sorry, what are we going to do? I just don't see that that's a safe way to go about it. Like, I'm not going to sit back and feel comfortable and go, yeah, you're right. Like, I think the Labor Party have this under control, because I'm not seeing it elsewhere.
No.
And I come back to the climate thing, like, we're told that we should trust them on the 43%, that it's a flaw, that they're going to push harder than that they're going to do everything that they can to make sure that the 43% goes bigger than that. But there's no ratchet mechanism to actually push that ambition in the legislation. So what's going to make it happen? And then at the same time, they're doing things like opening up new oil and gas fields for exploration. Like, that's not the move of someone who's serious about reducing our carbon emissions. No. That's the move of someone who is continuing to push the interests of oil, gas, and coal interests. Yeah. Like, that's not... that doesn't give me confidence that over here, when it comes to the tax cuts in, I don't know, October or next budget, or whenever it might be that they get around to it, that they're finally going to say, yeah, look, we've listened, and boy, like, really tough decision, and we don't like going back on our promises, but we're going to repeal these tax cuts. I mean, that's nonsense.
Yeah. And apart from the fact that the longer they leave it, like the longer they sit and refuse to raise job seeker and the other social security payments, because I refuse to call them welfare, the longer those people are going to suffer. And they have already suffered for quite long enough under the previous government, right? This is not a Democrat.
Every day is unnecessary.
Yeah. Like, this is not a Democrat who have time to waste on this issue.
No, it is literally causing people irreparable harm to their physical health, to their mental health, to their emotional health. It leaves scars that last a lifetime. And every day that we choose to leave those people in a state of poverty is shameful.
Yeah. And it was Danielle Wood, in her keynote address to the Job Summit, talked about even being out of work for 3 months impacts people's future prospects.
Yeah.
Well, can impact people's future prospects for years afterward.
Yes.
Right. And so for every day we leave people on below poverty, it's unacceptable on so many levels.
I know we're going to get to it, and that talk by Danielle Wood was given at the Jobs and Skills Summit, and one of the groups that we were meant to be talking about the Jobs and Skills Summit was people who want to work but are unable due to issues of access or flexibility, right? So there's a whole range of people in the workforce who would like to work, but because of issues of health, mental health, physical disability, cognitive disability, their ability to work and participate in the workforce is limited and not as reliable as it is for others, right? So there's this sort of spectrum of capability that means, like, someone who's struggling with mental health can't keep a 9-to-5, 5-day-a-week job where every day they get up and they go in and they perform tasks and then they come home again. Like, their health just isn't up to it. They need to be able to wake up, assess how they're doing, go or not go, get paid for the days that they can. But they need the financial backing that says on the days that they're not working, they're going to be taken care of still, right?
Yes.
And at the moment, we've got this system where pretty much, if you're on a disability pension, which some of them are, or you're on job seeker, which many of them are and shouldn't be, as soon as you begin working any hours, you immediately get taken off your benefits. And it's one of the issues that needs to be addressed, because we've got this group that are being kept out of the workforce because the access isn't there, and the equity is not there, the flexibility is not there, and yet we're not only vilifying them in the media, we're punishing them with this sort of destitution level social benefit.
And, having hundreds of thousands of people living below the poverty line because as a society we choose that, And as a society, we have chosen to punish them for, we put them below the poverty line as an incentive to stop being poor. It's not just take the moral and ethical thing out of it. It's economically stupid because it is such a waste of the greatest capital that a nation has, which is its people.
Mhm.
And if you've not been in poverty, it's difficult to understand exactly how damaging and limiting being poor is. How instead of being able to be creative and innovative and to dream big and to be productive, all of that energy and creativity and productivity goes into trying to survive on a day-to-day basis, right? So you and I are reasonably well-paid people. In fact, we'd probably argue that we're both incredibly well-paid people.
Very.
And that
I am.
frees us up. We have a level of comfort and a level of privilege that frees us up to bring our best selves to work and work hard, be
Mhm.
productive, innovate, add value to not just our employers, but to society, to our lives, all that
Mhm.
sort of stuff.
All those things. Yep.
And there are literally hundreds of thousands of people in this country who do not have that privilege and can't do that because all of all of their efforts have to go into the daily dilemma of, do I eat or do I pay the rent? Do I buy the medicines I need for my chronic illness or do I eat?
Yeah.
And
Kids need more clothing. Do they
yeah,
have a school excursion that I need to try and scrape the few dollars together for, or whatever it might be?
mm,
But that it's a constant weight, and I really can't stress enough how bad it is. Like
mm.
it's not something that I would wish on anyone, and it really is something that we need to see solved.
And then on top of all of that, we pay private companies billions upon billions of dollars
Yeah.
to police and oversee this literal industry of poor people. Like, we have literally turned poor people into a commodity that these private companies sell back to the government for billions of dollars in profit.
Yeah, it's like a
You know,
$9 billion a year industry, and it's again. Rick Morton did a piece in the Saturday paper, I think 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, and he took a good look at the employment services industry in Australia, and I use all of those words with care, and like essentially the whole program of training, mutual obligations, the works is a revolving door of profiteering is the bottom line when you sort of read through that investigation and analysis. It's
yeah.
appalling.
And it's profiteering on taxpayer dollars. Like, all of these companies have contracts with the government to provide these services. Like, they're
I think
not,
Yeah, I think one of the
you know,
things that the coalition government did over the last 9 years that they were most effective at, and it is a short list, but they were very, very effective at this one thing, is finding ways for private companies to benefit from previously government services. So, like we take a public service and we dismantle it and we privatize it and we pay for it with taxpayer funding. So
yeah.
you and I are still paying for it, but instead of funding a public sector with public sector workers looking after the community, we instead fund a private company whose first responsibility is to their shareholders, and
And the
then
profit motive.
and the profit motive drives pretty much everything else, and then the product in that sense is essentially unemployed people.
Yeah. And for $9 billion a year, we could dismantle that whole thing, get rid of mutual obligations, get rid of this impetus,
Yeah,
all these hoops that people have to jump through in order to prove they are worthy of the pittance of money that we give them. We
yeah.
could raise job seeker to a livable wage. And even if all those people currently working in those employment and training organisations were themselves rendered unemployed by us cancelling all these contracts, we
We'd be waiting
still
for
would have money left over from that $9 billion a year, you
Yeah,
know?
mutual for the avoidance of doubt, mutual obligations is something that should go. They're punitive and they're performative. I think it's been shown time and time again that they don't actually help anybody get into work. They make it harder in some cases. The new system, which is a point-based system, if you're a full-time student, you don't earn enough points to meet your mutual obligation threshold. So you're doing full-time training to learn something, and that doesn't give you enough points to meet your mutual obligation. If you spend all of your time, 40 hours a week, going to job interviews, that does not give you enough points to meet your mutual obligations. Like, it doesn't actually make a great deal of sense, but it's not intended to, except from the point of view of ensuring that we've got this group of people who are forever on this revolving door of employment service, training service, back to employment service, where the training service is actually owned and operated by the employment company, and around they go.
Yeah. And again, not every course that you can be a full-time student in actually qualifies to give you points at all. So you could be training to fill one of the many skill gaps we have in this country that, in theory, should set you up to be a productive and hopefully well-paid member of society.
Yeah.
And in the short term, you will get 0 points for that effort, and you have to cobble together the 100 points a month that you're required to do outside of that.
It's not a good system, to put it bluntly. It's not a good system. It's certainly not delivering on its purpose, at least its stated purpose, which is helping people find employment. It's not a good replacement for the old Commonwealth Employment Service. It feels regressive, it feels punitive, and it's certainly performative, and it's expensive, and it's not really doing anybody good except for those people who own and operate those employment services, it would seem.
Yeah, it feels like sort of performative cruelty, and the cruelty is the point.
Yeah.
Because it's designed to make sure that people like you and I are fucking terrified of becoming unemployed.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think probably more the target for this particular program are the casual workers in places like universities who are being placed on these sort of short-term rolling contracts. They need to reapply for their jobs year in year, casual teachers who are never given permanent teaching roles, people who work in casual hours in hospitality and that kind of stuff. Just over there is this group of people who serve as a warning to you that things could be worse, so maybe don't arc up too much. Have we mentioned that you should join your union? Because if we haven't, you should join your union.
Yes, you really, really, really should. And you're right. Yeah, it's the precariat who are being sent a warning that you think you got it bad now in the gig economy. Try being unemployed.
Yeah, and it bothers me when on the other lever, if you like, or the other warning sign is skilled migrant workers. This is the other sort of key lever to keep workers in their place, it feels. And this was touched on during the Jobs and Skills Summit. It was pretty much always going to be one of the things that was brought up and changed, but they've increased the threshold or the number of skilled migrant workers or visas that will be given out each year. They've made it easier for students, international students who are studying in Australia, to stay on and work for longer periods of time, this kind of stuff. But that's another group. Happy to be here. I won't make too much trouble because I'm glad I don't have to go back home to my other country. I much prefer to be in Australia, and this is a path to permanent residency one day down the line. It's essentially, again, being used as a lever to just stop Australian workers getting too uppity and asking for too much. As a result, it really shouldn't come as a surprise to people that our wages are suppressed, even though corporate profits are rising astronomically. Corporate profits are rising currently, and this data only came out today, 3.5 times faster than wages over the last 12 months.
Greg Jericho had an amazing graph on Twitter today showing the I think the profit data came out and he graphed it, and he had one line going up and up and up and up, which is profits, and then another line that was just stumbling along the bottom, which was wages, the gap between the two. Yeah,
like the rate of growth of profits is, and I think for this quarter alone, it was 7.6%. Seasonally adjusted for business profit, and it was 3.3% for wages, which was a great result for wages, but in historical terms, but we also went backwards 2.8% because CPI went through the roof. But corporate profits outperformed CPI.
Mm.
And again, as the Australia Institute and Richard Dennis did some analysis late last month in August, corporate profit is one of the key drivers of price rises at the moment. It's not wages, it's not other costs, it's profits. So if we're worried about inflation and we're sort of thinking that something needs to be reined in the economy, it's not wages that are the issue, it's profits.
Yeah. So, listeners, price rises is another term for inflation. So, the inflation that we're currently experiencing is driven in not just because of global shortages of things, because of the war in Ukraine, but also driven in large part by profits and companies choosing to raise their prices because they can under the cover of the war in Ukraine and COVID and everything else.
Now's a great time. Now's a great time if you're a business to sit there and go, look, global supply chain, war, pandemic, there's drought in Europe. I've just got to raise my prices. I have to. Sorry, kids to feed. What you going to do? And then bank a massive profit and pretend that that the two aren't connected.
Yeah, the unfortunate reality we're in is that the Reserve Bank and governments of all stripes are harkening back to the 70s, the last time we had a massive inflation outbreak, and freaking out and going, we must crush spending, we must crush demand in order to then crush inflation. It's like, but it's not driven by demand. There is no such, the wages are not breaking out at the moment. There is not a demand on wages.
Rein in the greed.
Yeah.
There's a job for you. Rein in the greed. And then
Windfall
we'll be okay.
Profits tax, people.
Something. Look, and while we record this, the Reserve Bank meets tomorrow, at 2:30 p.m. tomorrow afternoon, they'll release their decision on what to do with the cash rate. They're almost certain to increase it. It's almost certain to be the wrong thing to do. Again, it's not really going to help inflation in the way that they want to, but it's the only thing that they've got that they can do because the government won't do the thing that it should do.
Yeah, if you're about to cop an increase in your mortgage again, and let's keep in mind that interest rates are now 200 points higher than they were before. Was it before the election? I can't remember.
Close, yeah.
This is all designed to crush your demand on things, and I suspect that a lot of people feel that their demand has been pretty much crushed, but inflation is still rising because corporate profits.
Yeah. The thing is, though, Elana, if that's your concern, if you're concerned that demand is high and what you need to do is rein in demand, you know what's a terrible idea? Tax cuts.
Tax cuts to rich people?
Tax cuts are a bad idea. Tax cuts are a bad idea. Tax cuts are a bad idea. You know what else is a bad idea? Spending even more money on an industry that is already experiencing severe shortage. Construction, for example, shortage of staff, shortage of materials, shortage of equipment. There's some amazing stories going around the industry at the moment around the shenanigans to secure cranes on building sites, the heavy equipment that are needed to move, sections of freeway or sections of railway or whatever it might be to form. All of that heavy machinery is limited, and we can't get more into this country because shipping supply chains are an issue. But as a result, the cost of hiring a crane per day keeps going up and up. So the cost of construction per day goes up and up. Wages and the cost of all of the materials is going up and up. And what did we do in the May budget? We threw an extra $10 billion into infrastructure spending. The same week, the New South Wales government was going, actually, we're going to put a whole bunch of infrastructure on hold because these costs are just stupid.
Yeah.
We just fueling a fire at the moment, and there's no point. Like, this sector at least is doing really, really well. Let's spend our money somewhere else. One of the places that you might spend that money, and again, like, this is just an idea, childcare, early childhood education, those two things, do them.
Yeah. Because, I mean, infrastructure is a brilliant spend for governments to make when they need to pump prime a stalling economy, because
Great idea.
it pushes demand into the economy.
Yeah.
But demand, like when demand is already through the roof, infrastructure spending is a terrible idea. And as you said, it needs to go into things like services. It needs to go into things that will unblock productivity and resources and all.
Spend it
Yeah,
on a productive asset if you need to spend it on something.
yeah.
Why not?
And
Like, that makes
if you
sense.
need to, yeah, like if you need to invest in raising people's wages in aged care and childcare and hospitals and
Education is a
education.
good
Yeah,
investment, you know.
yeah.
And look, so coming back to the jobs and skills summit for a minute, like some of the stuff that came out of that around things like TAFE places and investing in, like, the government, part of the government announcement was an extra $1 billion in this sort of short-term funding around TAFE, additional fee-free TAFE places, something like 465,000 additional TAFE places. Costs are going to be shared with the state governments. Like, that's a great idea.
Mm,
Excellent. Good
mm,
idea for those people who need to retrain, for those people who need skills in order to get work or stay in work. That's great. Might want to tie that to the just transition or to the energy transition. So we skill up our coal, oil, and gas workers and get them into a new career. Maybe that might
mm.
be an idea. That kind of investment, go for it.
Yeah.
But we're just not thinking through the sort of flow-on impacts of some of the stuff that we're spending money on.
No. And employers really need to let go of this notion that they can get away with not raising wages. All these people screaming about how they just can't find staff. It's like, well, I don't know, maybe if you fucking paid them properly, people would be willing to work for you. I
Yeah.
saw an
Mm.
article about Dan Murphy's literally offering a job interview to literally anybody who wants one because they cannot find people to work for them. In
Yep.
lockstep with that is a suggestion from a retail association that we maybe allow 13-year-olds to work. And it's like, hang on, you guys are so determined not to pay people properly that you're now
That's right.
advocating for child labour.
Yes. Or pensioners, like
Yeah,
the elderly.
yeah,
Let's recruit the elderly. Let's recruit kids.
yeah.
But for God's sake, like, let's not consider that we actually increase wages to a point where people are willing to do this job. Like,
Mm.
that's
It's absolutely insane. Like,
there are some industries out there that I know are really struggling and they find it hard to pay higher wages. I get that, and I take the time to speak to any number of cafe owners when I go and get a coffee and chat to them. My local butcher and greengrocer and those sorts of people, I always chat and see how they're doing. Most of them are working solo. Most of them are unable to provide. They can't predict when the busy days will be and when they need the support, and it's
yeah.
not worth it for them. Like, they can't afford to have people on staff who aren't needed, and
Mm.
equally people who are only being offered 2 days a week, 3 days a week, a couple of shifts here or there when I need you. Can't do that because they need reliability. They need
Mm.
they need to be able to be confident that they can pay the rent, that they can like buy food and all of those sorts of things. So they're looking for jobs that are more stable. That cuts out an awful lot of jobs in the central business districts around the country.
Mm.
Most of those retail outlets, those cafes, restaurants, that kind of thing, you'll read story after story after story of those smaller businesses who are really struggling to adapt with the rents that they're paying on some of these spaces versus just the variability and the unpredictability of their customer base. What days people are coming into the city, what days people might spend money, and therefore when they might pay staff. So there is absolutely groups out there where that idea of like pay them a higher wage just doesn't flow through, and that's fine. But there's an awful lot that you just sort of sit there. I saw a suggestion from a farming group recently that they be able to pay people in fruit.
Oh, yes. And thankfully that got ripped to pieces as it so deserved to be done, because it's
Yeah,
like, really? You want to reintroduce the feudal system?
pretty much.
Because that's going to help productivity.
what you're looking for are serfs.
Yes.
Literally, what you're talking about is a serf.
And to speak to the French and Russian monarchies about how,
How that played out
pissing
over
off the
time.
serfs worked out for them.
Yeah. But literally that was the suggestion. So, the idea of getting 13-year-olds back into the workforce, maybe they could get a forklift license. I know that idea's been floated in the past. There just seems to be in the same week and in the same period that we're talking about record profits for business and where we're talking about a record share of national income going to shareholders and going to business profit. It just doesn't stack up to be sitting there saying, now is not the time to raise wages.
Mm. And as you said, it's not all businesses are having record profits, and that's
Hashtag not all businesses.
I feel like something that we as a nation have sort of, in some ways, have become sort of economically illiterate about, and that is productivity and what productivity actually means. And I'll put a link to this in the show notes because Crikey published Danielle Wood's keynote speech in full, and it is really worth a read because she's got graphs galore in this. It's amazing. But she talks about productivity and how productivity has fallen globally over the last decade, but it's fallen further in Australia. So while, yes, the whole world is having a bit of a productivity slump, Australia's having a bigger one, which indicates that Australia is it's not doing everything it can to keep, we are literally falling behind the rest of the world. And one of the things that productivity does, productivity is not just doing more with fewer people, it's capital investment. It's rather than hiring more people to do manual tasks, you automate, you invest in machinery and equipment and things. And it also means that the movement of people from industry to industry. So an industry that is not being productive, that let's call it coal mining, just as an example, that is facing external pressures that mean that its markets are shrinking and all this sort of thing. People in that industry will naturally shift to other industries over time. And businesses and sometimes entire industries will just collapse. And that is normal economic activity because in pure economic terms, ideally, a productive economy has our resources, whether it be money, whether it be equipment, whether it be people, whether it be a mix of all three, going to where we are producing the most for the least cost. We're not doing that in Australia at the moment. And so for some of those poor small businesses who can't afford to hire people and give them stability in their hours and stability in the moments when I'm going to need you to come in and help me out, over the next 5-10 years, there probably will be a reckoning and some of those businesses may not survive.
Oh, yeah.
That's the harsh reality. But that doesn't mean that economically we're failing. It means that the people that those businesses would otherwise either employ or have employed will go to other businesses and other industries where they can be more productive. And even those business owners who sadly have lost their business, it frees them up to go do something productive. They might start a new business that has a better business model and has a chance of being more successful than their old business. Or they might return to being an employee and add value elsewhere. But we need to sort of encourage, first of all, we need to start being more productive, but we also need to start encouraging that and not seeing it as this terrible tragedy when certain industries or certain businesses, certain sectors suffer loss of productivity because there's usually a reason for it.
Yeah, there's always a degree of turnover in our businesses. Australia has 2-point-something million businesses. A lot of them are small. In any given year, I think about 500,000 start up and 500,000 plus or minus close, right? And I think about half of all businesses that are started don't last 12 months, and the number's closer to 90% by the time you get to 5 years. So there's a certain degree of activity as businesses start and people try things and they close again. What we're seeing, though, is a stifling of that activity. And instead of money being invested and reinvested, it's being consolidated and hoarded in essence. And it's sort of reached the point, I think, in that cycle of capitalism where the wealth has become concentrated so much that it's having a noticeable drag on the productivity of the economy. Like that's sort of where it feels like we're at, or we're very, very close. US corporations are sitting on a few $1 trillion worth of cash, and they're basically sitting on it. And it's money that should otherwise be back out, being reinvested in new ideas, being invested in R&D, being invested in, and those companies are sitting there going, yeah, but we're making plenty of money, so we don't have to. But that is, in fact, the drag on the economy, where we're not getting that reinvestment, where we're not getting the training, where we're not getting the cross-pollination of ideas, where we're not getting that sort of creative churn that can happen. And let me just say, I don't want to dismiss the disruption that a business closing causes to the people involved, but it just sort of thinking of it at that macroeconomic level, we're not doing a good job in Australia of encouraging people to try things. We don't have the social safety nets in place that allow people to take those sorts of risks.
Yes.
And that's a part of it. So when we talk about things like a universal basic income, one of the things that encourages, because it provides people with the means to survive, is it encourages creative pursuits in business and production of new value. It encourages creative pursuits in the arts and culture, in the performing arts. It encourages people to go and volunteer and help in their community. That's the kind of productivity that we're talking about. It's not just about, you working a little bit harder or hitting the keys a little bit faster, or, that's sort of, hamster wheel type stuff. That's not what we need.
Yeah, no, you're right. And in her speech, Danielle Wood was saying how Australia, we are really behind Europe and America in terms of things like our take-up of AI and other technologies.
Yeah.
And it's those kinds of things that can then help that productivity. Because as you said, our corporations are sitting back and going, well, we've successfully suppressed wages and we're sitting on, record profits. We don't need to invest in capital and machinery and people.
We're operating an effective monopoly. So what does it matter? And where they are doing it, they're doing it to further suppress wages and further sort of cut their workforce, rather than increase their productivity to grow and produce more things. And that's like the other problem, is that those new investments are simply putting people out of work, not generating wealth that's shared.
And, the one area in which we have massive productivity is in these corporations lobbying governments to get a better deal on shit, rather than... So, it's a must-read, people. You really should read this speech. It's
Danielle
slightly
Wood,
terrifying.
Wharton Institute. I think it was September 1. She was the second speech at the Jobs and Skills Summit, or maybe the third, but very early in the day, and really seemed to set an interesting tone to proceedings.
Yeah. And coming back to the issue of immigration, people are quite rightly going, well, that's great that you want to increase the immigration caps. Where are these people going to live?
Yeah.
How are they going to pay for petrol? How are they? And that is a valid question. But Bernard Keane was writing in Crikey and saying that government and business both see immigration as this brilliant stopgap measure to plug skill sets and all this sort of, skill gaps and that sort of stuff. But studies have shown that while immigration can come in and it can plug critical skills gaps and all this sort of thing, it also creates additional demand in the economy. And so the productivity benefits and economic benefits that business and government argue we get through immigration often don't materialize, because they consume as much as immigration consumes as much as it produces. I shouldn't say they, because it's not the fault of immigrants. So that's one of the I think double-edged swords of this idea at the Job Summit that I think was in some ways probably agreed to a little bit too readily. There does need to be a focus on training and education and utilising the human resources that we have available to us here and now, which comes back to our discussion about job seeker and as you said, like universal basic income and giving people the freedom to experiment, maybe fail, maybe nail it next
Yeah, that's right.
time.
One thing I will say about the immigration question, a lot of the people that we're talking about are already in the country. In order to apply for the relevant visa, they have to already be here. So they are already consuming resources. They do already have somewhere to stay or not. So they're already creating that kind of burden on the system.
It's a really good
What
point.
would change is that they can become contributors to the productive side of the economy, right? So, and we get the benefit of their skills and experience and expertise and cultural diversity and all of those sorts of good things that we would like to see. So, like, there's that, and that's a good argument. I think that the other side of the immigration argument, though, and we talked before about it being almost a warning to our precariat workforce. What's the investment in that local skills base? So fine. What do we, okay, let's look at migrants to close some of that labour gap and that skills gap that we currently have, and certainly let's take that at face value. We also, though, need to ensure that we rebuild our university sector, that we rebuild our vocational training sector, our technical training sector, that we ramp up our schools-based VCE or TAFE-based, our schools-based TAFE and schools-based apprenticeship type programs, like those sorts of things. Let's use this opportunity while we're at it to reinvigorate those parts of the economy so that in 5 years' time, we're not still reliant on importing workers from overseas, that we're actually doing the job of building up our own skills. Fine, let's make sure we do both of those. And I think, for all that, the Jobs and Skills Summit dealt with the range of things. If you think about the broad groups that you would want to see represented, I think the main group that we really didn't see strong representation from was that long-term unemployed group, the vulnerable, the people who have that access, equity, and flexibility issues and concerns about the workplace as it currently stands. They didn't seem to be as represented. And whilst there was discussion about some of it, I wasn't hearing the conversation targeting NDIS participants. Those segments of the community didn't really seem to have a voice. But for all that, it was at least good to see the ACTU standing up there with the Business Council of Australia, with the government, with representatives from the Greens and the other parties and the other parts of politics, the likes of ACOS, like the Council of Social Services, various fairly broad spectrum of stakeholders in society, not in the economy, but in society more broadly, looking at this issue and saying, how can we come up with, some sort of fair, equitable and long-term thinking around this issue? Probably the one thing that I didn't see as strongly come through in the outcomes is the specific issue of wages growth. Not quite. There was some talk around collective bargaining and multi-sector bargaining and that kind of stuff. We'll see if that can come through. That's great. But the business community support for those sorts of ideas lasted, I don't know. I doubt the signatures were dry on the joint statement coming out of the summit before the Australian Financial Review started tearing those ideas down. But there you go. That was bound to happen. But at least there was some sort of common cause and a reasonably adult conversation took place. Over in the sidelines, we had the Liberal Party sort of dribbling their food and, being upset about stuff. But otherwise, it was a reasonably grown-up conversation.
And I do think it was a good sort of first step, I think, in reimagining who we want to be as a country, what kind of society we want to be. Again, Danielle Wood mentioned the extraordinary opportunities we have available to us. As she said, once again, Australia is the lucky country. We have all the minerals needed that are going to be in massively high demand for renewable economies. We have an abundance of wind and solar and hydro and all that sort of stuff. We have these incredible opportunities if we choose to invest in them and invest in the people who can deliver them to
That's
us.
right.
So there's all of that. So as a good first step, and I think it was John Kudelka who had a brilliant cartoon about the Jobs and Skills Summit just being just the first, and then there's the Tax Reform Summit, and then there's the I think an Economic Summit, and then there's the Climate Summit, and so yeah, it was. And again, being in the first 100 days of the Albanese government, it was a really good sign. It was far more sort of interest and creativity in who we are as a people than we've seen from government in a really, really long time.
Agreed.
Ironically, probably since the last Labor government. So that was great.
Yeah.
And I think also it's a newsflash for people, but we live in a society.
Yeah.
We don't live in an economy.
Yes.
And we need to structure society in a way that will support the economy and allow the economy to, in turn, feed and support society.
Yeah.
And
we should have an economy that helps drive our standards of living, to support those, to build those, to support our creative endeavours, our cultural endeavours, our sporting endeavours. The economy should exist so that we can do those other things. Instead, what we seem to be doing, or what we have been doing for a little while, is sacrificing those things in service of the economy. We can't spend money on the arts because economy, and we can't spend money on cultural institutions because the economy. We can't, and that's completely around the wrong way. It really just is.
Yeah. So I'd give them a B plus. Because, again, as you said, they didn't touch on all the things that I would have liked them to have touched on. Tax cuts, raising job seeker, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Peter Van Onselen was initially sceptical and critical of this, which seems to be his shtick. But he did acknowledge after the summit, as we've just done, that it was a really good start. But one of the reasons why he was critical of it was he wanted it to be a much broader based review of things. So look at taxation reform, look at structural reform in society. Yeah. But then it would have needed to have been like a week-long summit. And I think...
Take a week. Take a week.
Yeah.
These are big issues.
Yeah,
take a week.
Yeah.
I mean, I think,
but Yeah. I'm hoping, because I work in software development and my team is an agile team where we look at continuous improvement and, we start off with a minimum viable product and we keep building on top of that. I'm kind of hoping that the Albanese government is going down that path of going, well, we'll start with the Jobs and Skills Summit, get everybody in the room, get them talking, get them cooperating, which is the first time in a long time that they've done that. To have Jennifer Westacott and Sally McManus on Insiders at the same time, basically tag teaming David Spears as they go, no, we're good. We have agreed on this, as he tries to find gotcha moments and get them to argue with each other. It's enormous progress for very, very early on in a new government. So I'm hoping to see continuous improvement and that we'll get to some of the big ticket items that you and I are passionate about.
That part's positive. So far, what we're seeing from this government is a darn sight of an improvement over the previous one. No argument from me there. Like they're definitely doing better. I do feel concerned that we seem to be continuing some of these, these sort of neoliberal pro-capitalist ideas, just around how we're treating some of our more vulnerable members of society. We don't seem to be tackling this question of how do we ensure that everyone has a right to live a dignified life? Just as a basic question, how do we ensure that happens? How do we ensure that our economy delivers that outcome? And instead, we seem to be arguing that our economy can only support some people to live a dignified life, and others, we're afraid, are going to have to be left out in the cold. And I don't think that's an ambition that we should settle for in this country. I think we can do much better than that.
Absolutely. And I do feel like the government is falling into old traps and old ways that no longer serve us as a nation, that at the time would have been hot button issues prior to the pandemic, but having been through almost 3 years now of the pandemic and the wrenching changes that, like this new reality that we've sort of found ourselves in, there do seem to be old paradigms that aren't relevant. This obsession with debt and deficit. I mean, The coalition racked up $1 trillion worth of debt. Not all of it related to the pandemic, I should point out. Quite a lot of it was prior to the pandemic. But governments across the world just went, you know what? Debt is not the giant monster that it used to be prior to the pandemic. This nation is going to be in debt for decades to come. That $1 trillion is going to take decades to pay down. So why are we acting like we need to pay it down in our very first budget? Why are we tossing as you said, the dignified lives of our most vulnerable onto the sacrificial altar of paying down the debt?
Yeah, going back to the Howard and Costello years, like during the early stages of the mining boom, Howard and Costello almost made the mistake of paying down our national debt completely. And somebody had to explain to them the role of the bond market and why it was important that there always be some government debt circulating in the economy. It's a necessary part of our economy and the way our financial systems work, that there is always some government debt. And Costello is like, we can pay off all the debt. Like, this is all, isn't this? No?
Yeah,
it's not?
awesome.
No?
No?
Why? Hang on. Why not? Someone explain this to me. And it's only been, up since then. But, for a while, we were trying to.
Yeah.
It's not necessary.
No. And also there's this weird short-sightedness that Chalmers and Albanese have going into what is going to be an October budget, is that they are ruling out stuff that will make money in the long term, right? They're ruling out literal investments. They're ruling out changes that they can spend money on that will have, in some cases, an immediate financial return for the nation, because they don't want to be spending any more money than they already are. And then it swings back around to the tax cuts.
It just doesn't make sense.
So thank you for that. Another wonderful venting session about the ills that our country faces.
Pleasure. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much to Steve for his insights and for letting me vent to him about the utterly absurd Stage 3 tax cuts. I've put links in the show notes to Danielle Wood's incredible keynote speech from the Job Summit, as well as Karen Middleton's articles about the curious coincidence of the Governor-General and Scott Morrison, Rachel Withers' evisceration of the Stage 3 tax cuts, and Rick Morton's piece on mutual obligations and what amounts to the selling of poor people for profit. I also tracked down the graph from Greg Jericho comparing company profits to wages, and an article from Richard Dennis on the real cause of inflation, company profits rather than consumer demand. And a quick walk of shame, the cartoon of the various summits that I referenced in the podcast was by the brilliant Kathy Wilcox and not John Kudelka. And that's also in the show notes. As I noted in the intro to this episode, the Governor-General's charity, which received millions of dollars in seed funding and then a guarantee of funding in perpetuity, has had its funding overturned by the government. Apart from the serious questions of propriety that arose about that arrangement, it seemed entirely sensible to cancel the funding if, as Treasurer Jim Chalmers keeps insisting, we can't afford crucial things like raising the rate of job seeker, then we certainly can't afford to fund a leadership charity boondoggle for the Governor-General. There's a link to an article about the defunding of the Future Leaders Program charity in the show notes as well. So lots of reading for you. We covered a lot in this episode, so if you're still listening, thank you so much for sticking with us. And we'll have more episodes for you very soon. Keep the Bastards Honest is brought to you by the Australian Democrats. This episode was edited and produced by me, Alana Mitchell. If you'd like to keep in touch, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn by searching for Australian Democrats. And you can see what we stand for, what we value, and what our policy positions are at our website at democrats.org.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.